welcome back to Rethinking Politics. We're glad to have you with us for episode 71. We have been trying to get started for quite a few minutes now, and the struggle is very real. So please bear with us. If we manage to say anything at all today, we're going to be very, very excited.
We're gonna take a big
we are going to be talking about some pretty interesting stuff, but before we want to get into that, we want to cover a couple of procedural things. First, in honor of Dan not knowing who Dule Hill is, I'm wearing one of my Christmas presents, which is a shirt that says, "Did you hear about Pluto down here? That's messed up." So if you get that reference, then 3 brownie points to you.
This is Gus's pickup line. It's beautiful.
Speaking of Psych, the TV show, one of our listeners has graciously pointed out that we have been pronouncing Brett Weinstein instead of Weinstein. I've heard it both ways. No, honestly, that's our bad. If you've been listening to us for a while, I, for one, am always impressed when we're able to pronounce anything correctly. But the number of times we've mentioned his name, we should have pronounced that correctly.
What's funny is I think we've shifted it over time. I think we initially were saying it Weinstein.
That we probably were. I think our best solution is we're just going to refer to them as Brett and Heather, since we struggle with both of their last names, and that should solve most of our problems. Because Brett I can handle. I can say Brett pretty darn well. Never had an issue with that. Anything beyond that, and it's toast. So.
We also mispronounced. I called Richard Dawkins Charles Dawkins. In my defense, everybody's named Charles at this point. Like I taught
great defense.
I taught a lecture in which I called a guy Charles whose first name wasn't Charles. Charles, for whatever reason, is my go-to first name.
Is your go-to?
I don't know how that happened. I don't actually know a single person by the name of Charles.
I think everyone should have a go-to first name. just ready to use.
Usually I refer to people as Bucket. I don't even know if that's even a name, but probably a little more derogatory than Charles, but
man.
What do you do?
I don't know.
I just want you to know
you do, that's
that
sure.
Having reviewed these names and looking to our future, we promise nothing.
I can honor that promise.
There are going to be no guarantees. So if this really bothers you, I'm sorry.
Okay, before we lose the rest of you, I'm going to tell you what we're going to be talking about today, because it's not just names. So we want to talk about a couple of things that are closely related. We want to talk about transgender issues and parental rights. And the segue into this is Abigail Shrier, who has written a book called Irreversible Damage: The Transgender Craze Seducing Our Daughters, which came out in 2020, so it came out last year. And when it came out last year, she did the rounds on a lot of podcasts. You know, she was on Joe Rogan and Jordan Peterson, among others. I haven't listened to the Joe Rogan one. I listened to the Jordan Peterson one, around the time that it came out, a year ago.
Mm-hmm.
And it was very, very good. And quite recently, she read a speech that she gave, or tried to give, at a college, ended up giving it off campus to a few students. And she read that speech on Honestly with Barry Weiss, which was amazing. It wasn't even about her book. It wasn't about transgender issues. It was specifically about speaking out, and in an age where you really can't.
Yeah,
which was fascinating.
The main topic was basically what is it like to be so hated, which was interesting. The way it was really, really worth listening to.
But anyways, I mean, in this past year, it's something that Dan and I have both been aware of and both been thinking about and both been considering discussing on our podcast, because it is a relevant and important discussion to have in the political conversation today, and it is a conversation that is being had, probably not as often as it should be had, maybe. And we're gonna make our way into this discussion as gracefully as we can. So not very gracefully.
Belly flop incoming. No, we're not like figure skaters on ice. So one of the things that's interesting about this, you could start at a lot of different points, and most people start from a psychological framework. What is gender dysphoria, or I mean, in some circles, that term itself at this point has been discarded. The idea is what is the phenomenon that's happening? How do you help these people? What works? What doesn't? What are the people jump right into the practical aspect. You mentioned parental rights, which is where we want to start, because
end up,
or run into at some point, maybe touch on here and there. The reason that we want to start with parental rights, or discuss parental rights specifically, is because as far as the political question is concerned, this is the point of contact between the state trying to act well on behalf of these children versus others who have authority over them.
Or at least we should say this is where we believe the point of contact becomes the most important.
Fair. That's fair.
That when it comes to trans rights, for me, it's not even that controversial. You know what I mean? That for any adult who I mean, whether they wish to identify as a different gender or as no gender, or they want to physically change their bodies to conform to whatever gender beliefs or gender identity they have, whatever it is, and obviously I'm not describing it correctly as they would, but all of that whole thing for adults, I have no issues with.
Right.
You know what I mean? And
right. Unrelated to concepts of gender and sexuality and these things.
Yeah, exactly. That's pretty straightforward in terms of what role the government should play, at least according to me, which is no role, basically.
Which is why do they need to play any role in someone going to a doctor and asking for a procedure or something?
Yeah, exactly. And so I believe that's worth mentioning that we're not opposed to trans rights in that sense. And really where it becomes more dicey, and that's something that you'll see in Abigail Shrier's book, is when you have children involved.
Yeah, and rights in this case being in the classic sense of we don't think anyone should stop them by force, right? There's no reason that we see to advocate for adults some kind of law preventing them from modifying
whether or
their
not
bodies.
I personally believe that you pick your own gender or anything like that is irrelevant to the political discussion. My personal beliefs on transgenderism has nothing to do with it. But my political beliefs are clear. I think that it should be absolutely allowed for adults.
Right. So where it gets sketchy is when we're talking about children. And there are a variety of points at which children become the focus of this. One of the things that tends to happen is that this is something that occurs at a young age or around puberty. I'm not sure exactly how diverse it is in terms of when it can occur. Most commonly, if I understand it correctly, most commonly it occurs when they're quite young, often as young as 3, and this onset of gender dysphoria, this idea that you are in the wrong body or that you are, there's something wrong with you physically that you strongly dislike and can fixate on. Or it can happen around puberty. And the question is, again, if this were something, well, the question then at that point is who has the authority to decide? And this is where it comes into contact with basically who is responsible for the child, and to what degree is the child autonomous versus under the authority of some other body, whether it be the state or whether it be the parents or whether it be their schools or whatever it may be. What is the freedom of the child in the context of society, and where is the authority over the child? And that seems to be, because in some ways you could analyze the validity of the decision, but the political question to a large degree is who is making the decision and by what right do they have authority to make that decision? This is the political theory question.
And this is where Shrier's concerns come in with irreversible damage, because what she's arguing is that the only politically correct belief to have right now is that only an individual knows what their true gender is, including children. So only the child knows their true gender, and they have a right to do whatever they would like to honor that true gender, including changing their hormones, changing their physical body, as well as changing, how people address them and how they're seen by society. And they have all of those rights even as a child, and that it's no place for any adult, whether it's their parents or a doctor or a therapist or their school teacher, to stop them or discourage them in any way. And so she talks about how what that's led to is what she calls, affirmative care, where if there's a child who says, hey, I'm actually a boy, even though I, look like a girl and I want to change that, then, the therapist will refer her to the doctor, and the doctor will say, okay, well, then we'll start you on these blockers and put you on these hormones. Then we'll go from there to here and here.
Mm-hmm.
And then she goes on to argue that the problem with this, and her biggest problem with this, is that a lot of these kids who are making that request are doing so not because they actually have what we would normally call gender dysphoria, but that they have something I think she calls it this, but the rapid onset gender dysphoria that is being triggered by a social contagion, that she's actually being influenced by her peers. And I say she because she thinks that this is a phenomenon that occurs primarily among teenage girls, that teenage girls are having a social phenomenon where other teenage girls are, coming out as trans and getting a lot of positive attention for it and pursuing, a sex change, and are doing it because of what they're seeing, that it's a social contagion. They're being infected by this idea because they're seeing other people do it, and they want to fit in, and they want to be popular, and they want to be liked, and all of these other things that all teenagers go through. But, especially teenage girls, the idea of a social contagion among teenage girls is at least somewhat well established.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
There's data on things like cutting is something that I think she references and talks about, that it acts as a social contagion, that whether or not a teenage girl is likely to cut herself, on her wrist, is more likely if she knows someone who's already cutting, and it kind of passes like that.
Right. It's been compared to a kind of a virus that goes through social groups, so that one of the clearest predictors of whether or not you're cutting is if you know other people who are cutting, right? Mm-hmm. Which is odd, because it's not like that. It's not like depression spreads to specific friend groups, right? There are a lot of things that don't. Mm-hmm. Most mental illness does not correlate socially. There are no social factors that you can reduce it to. You could look at environmental factors like isolation and things like that, which has a social component. But in terms of like who you know and your exposure to an idea, that rarely correlates with this. So this whole thing you explained happens within an interesting context in the social world, because what we could say is that there is biologically because we are to a degree biologically determined, at least in some areas, right? Our genes matter, our inheritance matters. You have a kind of a spread of certain contagions, some of which are not contagions, but actual inherent problems, right? Genetic problems that are passed on, and some of them are more random. They're not heritable traits, right? They're things that you pick up through other ways. And there's going to be a certain percentage of the population that experiences gender dysphoria. Just statistically, there's going to be a fairly steady number. Now, that number may be less on paper than what reflects the reality because of social stigmas.
Yeah. That
one way or another.
The numbers have been suppressed for a long time. Yeah. And so as soon as that social stigma disappears, it makes sense that there would be a large increase in that number, not necessarily because there was actually a real increase, but because more people were openly expressing
it. Because they're more public about it rather than because there are more people who fit into that category. And so there has been in the last decade, I think especially, there has been an increase in transgender people who identify as transgender and who go through these processes. And so trying to explain that, one possible explanation is what we were just saying, that the social stigma is now gone. And so people are now more open to admitting it. And so the numbers increase, even though the number of people who are actually affected by it hasn't increased.
Hasn't changed is the argument.
If this is a social contagion, then the more public it is, the more people you're going to get. And it doesn't affect, and it's not limited by the actual number of people affected by an actual disorder. And so, and I'm not saying that all transgender stuff is social, right? It's social contagion. That's not what we're saying. Gender dysphoria.
Are you saying it's a disorder though?
That gender dysphoria is a disorder?
Yeah, because you just called it a disorder. I'm just curious.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And there will be people who will contest that, right? That it's not a disorder. But setting aside whether it's a disorder or not, the number of people who experience it should be fairly static unless it's to the degree that it's divorced from social promotion, right? The degree to which the social factors.
Yeah, you're saying the stigma disappears. It should increase to a certain level and then stop.
Right.
And there should be that stopping point. And you're saying that if it's instead of social contagion, there's not necessarily a stopping point, but that it becomes more and more popular, that number will continue to grow because it's a social contagion, because it is actually being encouraged because of its popularity. And so you have people who really don't have gender dysphoria who are claiming to have it. Is that basically it?
That is basically the argument, right? This is how you would distinguish. How do you tell if it's a social contagion versus how do you tell if it's just more people coming out, essentially? And it's interesting. I've looked at a lot of numbers over the years on this with regards to homosexuality, but obviously that's even a very different thing than the number of transgender people. And the two aren't related. It's interesting. This point is made again and again, but it's worth stating here. You don't have to have your opinion about the rights of human beings in whatever sphere, be they, gays and lesbians or transgender or whatever, or transsexual or whatever it may be. Your perspective on that it doesn't determine necessarily where you fall in this argument, because obviously if it were a social contagion, right? It's a fashion, essentially, that is being promoted socially. Then that's fundamentally different than the people who are actually suffering from some kind of disassociation from their own body as it is, and seeing some kind of reality, right? We can separate these into two different things and say if it's a social contagion, it may or may not be good, right? And the long-term consequences. If you have some kind of social contagion and you're acting on it, it leads to your satisfaction.
You're making an excellent point that if you are a trans rights activist and you find out that a large number of kids who are claiming to be trans aren't and are getting sex changes, you shouldn't be in favor of that because that's not about trans rights at that point. Those kids who are faking it and then not even faking it is not quite the right term, because it's different than that. You know what I mean?
Right.
It's children and teenagers are not the same as adults. I think we're all aware of that fact. I mean, teenagers especially already have a reputation for making very terrible decisions and believing that they're the right decisions. You know what I mean?
Right.
Teenagers, so you can have teenagers who believe that they have, gender dysphoria and that they really are the wrong gender sincerely, but be completely wrong. And that's what she's arguing. And if that's the case, it's not really what she's arguing. It's not really about trans rights, but it's about a bunch of kids who are suffering needlessly. Yes.
And you could distinguish between these two groups, right? You could say one group needs to be treated one way, and the group that has been persuaded into this as a way to increase their popularity, or as a solution to other problems that are actually unrelated, or as whatever it may be that leaves them susceptible to this social contagion, that this group should be treated differently, right? They should not be treated as if they're trans. all of this is complicated by the fact that gender dysphoria in general tends to disappear. In the vast majority of cases, as high as 80%. I was looking at studies on this. The numbers vary, and it's hard to track people in any way. But as much as 80% of the people who experience gender dysphoria simply grow out of it. Right? It goes away. It goes away. Which again gives you some reason to wonder, what causes it, and to be suspicious of acting on it prematurely.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You mentioned teenagers. Teenagers are the most susceptible to social contagions, and this should be no surprise in that it's specifically teenage girls, for various reasons. We could get a lot into the psychology of this, but as a phenomenon, these things, adults aren't often cutting. Men aren't often cutting. It's usually, I don't know what the percentage actually is, but the majority, and probably the vast majority, are female, and they're young. They're generally teenagers.
Teenage girls.
And there's a reason for this. I know people who I laugh at. It's quite sad, who deal with very troubled teenagers, and have talked to them about the differences of various things. It's its own world in terms of how dysfunctional people can be right at the extremes. So where does that leave us? Go ahead.
Well, it leaves us in an interesting place because let's say that you're a trans rights activist and you're actually just here for the data. You're here for solutions for people, right? Mm-hmm. And you go and you look at Irreversible Damage, and you look at the investigation that she's done, and you conduct your own investigation, and you find that she's right. Then your reasonable response would be, okay, we need to make sure that before any kind of sex change is taking place for children, that they actually have legitimate gender dysphoria, and it's not just a social contagion. And so let's put in place solutions, as you were saying, to have two separate groups. Those who have a legitimate need for a sex change, and those who don't. And those who do, we can proceed, and those we don't, we won't. And so what that would involve is things like changing affirmative care, from therapists to parents to teachers to doctors, to say, hold on, let's look at it, and maybe there's some tests we can do and some questions and a little bit more work with these kids to find out what's actually going on. Right? And there's all of this that could take place, and I think something that Abigail Shrier would be very happy about, and none of which are things that I'm opposed to. But that's not really what we want to talk about here, because that doesn't fully address all of the problems, because, well, it addresses some of the problems, but it doesn't address all of the problems. And all of the problems here include the fact that you have situations where, especially here with this gender dysphoria, where the therapists, where the doctors, where the school teachers step in and take charge over what the child is and isn't going to do in terms of a sex change or hormone blockers, or even how they view themselves. And that's where it gets into the question of parental rights, because historically, all of these decisions were decided by the parents. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. What the child did in every respect was decided by the parents. And as time has gone on, that has shifted, but it hasn't shifted a lot. Today, in terms of children, parents decide the vast majority of things for their children. Parents control 95% of their children's lives. I mean, even with schools, parents can pull their kids out of school voluntarily. They don't have to defend their reasoning and put them in a different school or even homeschool them. You know what I mean? In the United States, that is in most places, that is a perfectly legal thing to do. In some states, there are stricter requirements about what that homeschooling looks like. But for the most part, you're free to take control in any aspect of your child's life that you would like. And obviously, there are exceptions to that where the government can intervene, but they're usually pretty extreme. You know what I mean? There has to be things like abuse or child neglect, and there has to be, at least some evidence for that in order for the government to do that, for the most part. and you can argue back and forth about the CPA and when they shouldn't get involved. But for the most part, parents have free reign.
Mm-hmm.
And what's interesting about this gender dysphoria, and something that she talks about, is there are lots of cases here where that's not the case. Where if a child wants to have these changes, there's little that a parent can do to stop it. And that's considered just by this new movement, because the argument is that the child decides. And so if we step around the argument of a social contagion and we find a child who actually wasn't interacting with anyone who was considering, transitioning.
It wasn't influenced by others.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And just of their own mind decided that they wanted to be that they are a different gender and would like to have a sex change done, then the only just thing is for that to happen, and the parents shouldn't be able to stop them from doing it. And that's obviously a big problem for a lot of parents out there. But it gets into the discussion of what is the role of parents in a child's life, and what are the principles that we should be using in deciding when a parent should decide, and deciding when a child should decide, and deciding when a government should intervene between those two.
Yes, and this gets into the principles of this subject. Touch on all kinds of controversial things, from child labor to various types of parental discipline, and to all of the areas of what parents decide with their children, many of which are controversial. From ranging from even to strange religious practices or infrequent religious practices, where a parent may not want their child to receive certain kinds of medical care. Right? Some of this can be simple, like essentially anti-vaccination, and some of it can be very comprehensive and say no medical intervention of any kind and things like that. So there's a wide spectrum here, and navigating it requires some kind of principle and some kind of understanding of what is the relationship of a child to the state and the state's authority. What is the reach of the state over them versus the reach of their parent? When the two come into conflict, how do you resolve this, right? Which one ultimately has authority? And it's worth pointing out, I think, right off the bat, that if you decide that everybody is 100% under the authority of the state, every adult is, then a child just is too, right? It's very clear. It's very clear. If you believe that society and the interests of society, whatever they may be, always come first,
then it's easy. Yeah,
you just apply that same general rule to this, and of course the children are also people, so the state decides. Mm-hmm. If you think that there is some kind of line, some limitation on the government, and some sphere of independence for a human being outside of the authority of others, outside of what they're allowed by some either expert group or dictator or whatever form of government, even democracy, what outside of what the majority decides is okay. If you think that there is some kind of sphere for human action and choice and responsibility and independence, then it's at least possible that the child, then we can continue this discussion. If not, you can skip from here, I suppose. But it's interesting. If you look at how we interact regularly with children, I think a lot of how we behave intuitively reveals what we think of this, right? Mm-hmm. When we allow someone to babysit our kids, there's obviously some authority being transferred to that person. The parents obviously have some authority. They transfer that person. If you were at a park,
authority beyond what a stranger would have.
Yes. Mm-hmm. If you're at a park and a stranger comes up and tries to treat your child like an adult would treat, like a parent would treat their child, there's something wrong there. And I think everyone would agree with that there's a unique relationship between a parent and child that is singular. It's not like the relationship between siblings. It's not like the relationship between friends. It's not even like the relationship between another stranger adult and a child, right? It's
well, yeah. I mean,
unique.
we've talked about natural principles where we draw rights and other political ideas from, and how in, a state of nature, how adults interact with each other is one where any use of force would be unjust, except in, a protection of your own life and extensions of that. You know what I mean? In other words, you can't use force against someone else unless they use force against you, is the simplest way of putting it, right? Mm-hmm. And you quickly realize that doesn't work in a parent-child relationship. If the child says, "Hey, I want to go play in the street," or "Hey, I want to go outside in the snow and live out there barefoot and only," and et cetera, and you as a parent use force to stop them, that's called parenting. You know what I mean? Every time I buckle my child in the car seat, even though he doesn't want to go in the car seat, because he doesn't understand any of the risks that are associated with not buckling up in the car seat. He doesn't understand any of those major consequences. All he sees is that he doesn't want to have that restriction in his freedom, and yet I must restrict him to protect him. That's what a car seat is. That's what parenting is.
That's what parenting is. Yeah, the toddler who wants to run out on the road and can't even talk yet, right? It would be silly to think. No one would argue you can't restrict that child's choices.
Yeah, you can't restrict his freedom.
Right.
No. Yeah, it's understood to be perfectly reasonable for a parent to do that, even though if you look at that state of nature example between adults, there is no justification for it. There's no justification for me buckling another consenting adult into his own car, saying, "Hey, you need to wear this seatbelt because it will protect you." You know what I mean? And if you don't, I will buckle it for you. By use of force.
I will tie your hands down so you can't unbuckle it.
Yes, if I have to. If you want to go play in the street, I understand there are no cars right now, but I won't let you. I will body slam you before I let you walk into that street. You know what I mean? It doesn't work that way. We allow other adults to take risks all the time.
Right.
That we would never let our children take, even comparable risks.
Right. And it's worth noting that the line between being an adult and being a child is fairly arbitrary. We put an age on it because you have to draw a line somewhere. For legal purposes, a line must be drawn, and an age is convenient.
Yeah, and I think that could definitely be revisited.
It could.
I think the way the law is set up right now is tilted in really weird ways. Good examples of this are, you're 18 and, or you're 17, you're not allowed to vote, you're not treated as a legal adult, right? You have severe limitations on your freedom up until you commit a severe crime. And then they go and they look at you and they look at what you did and how you did it. And they say, "No, you're actually an adult and you're going to be tried as an adult." That's messed up. You know what I mean?
I thought you were going to the military example, because at 17 you can sign on to the military.
That's another. There's many.
There's a lot of
examples,
weird places where we bend the line.
Where when it suits the government's needs, they will treat a 17-year-old or sometimes even a 16-year-old as an adult. But there aren't a lot of avenues for a 16-year-old or 17-year-old who's mature enough to tell the government, "Actually, I'm an adult and should be allowed to do these other things." And so. Yeah. All I'm arguing there is it should be a revolving door. You know what I mean? If the government has a way of satisfying that their requirement that you're actually an adult at 17, you should be able to pursue that and satisfy that requirement another way.
Yes.
I mean, there are things
it needs to be able to work to your benefit as well as to your
detriment. Exactly. And so I do believe that there should be more fluidity that's favorable, not just fluidity that's negative in how the age works. Because right now it's only set up where it can only hurt you and not help you, which is stupid.
No, that's an interesting point. I hadn't thought about that. With this conversation, when we're talking about what it means to be an adult, obviously it's a scale, and so to have a line is odd. As a child grows up, they become more capable of assessing the risks, and a good parent gives a child more independence as they are capable of it, right? You want them to be at the edges of what they're capable of, and so that they're taking more and more responsibility for their life, so that there isn't, imagine if you treated a human being like a toddler, until they were 18 and then kicked them out of your house. And like, this is a bad parenting model, right? But despite the fact that there is a separate and related issue, which is as long as you're in your parents' household, even if you were an adult who's a guest, you're going to have to abide by their rules. But that's unrelated to the distinction between a child and adult, and is entirely a function of property rights, right? The fact that if you're going to use their stuff, you have to follow their rules.
And then resume normal life.
Right.
As a 13-year-old, when your dad says, as long as that you're under my house, under my roof, you can't be like, okay, well, I'm going to live under my own roof. You know what I mean?
Right.
It's not that simple.
Right.
As a 7-year-old, there's there's emancipation, but for the most part, as a child, that doesn't mean anything.
Uh-huh.
Really, what the dad is saying is, no.
So the point at which external involvement is uncontroversially good is at the point where the child's life is on the line or there is extreme abuse. Right? At that point, and this is to step back and put it more propositionally, a child has certain natural rights. In fact, they have all the natural rights of an adult, except in the realm of liberty, their ability to exercise those rights and to judge how they use those rights is limited. Mm-hmm. And it's at the discretion of whoever has authority over them. This is their legal guardian, whether that be a parent or whatever it is, right? This person judges the degree to which they can use their own discretion to navigate their life. But you can't, just because a child doesn't have the right to determine whether they're going to school today or not, whether they're going to be compelled to study or do their seatbelt, does not mean that they are less of a human being and don't have all of the other rights, right? You can't go and kick a random child on the street and be like, oh, he's not an adult, therefore he's basically subhuman, right? This is a human who just hasn't been given independence yet, essentially. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so there's a sphere in which they're not fully in control, while all the other spheres they're perfectly protected in. But this raises obvious questions of where is the line between? Yeah,
it quickly turns into a gray area because we can all agree that, let's say you have a family that joins a suicidal cult and the parents are trying to, are giving their kids, electric Kool-Aid without their kids knowing it. That's not okay. We can all agree that parents don't have the right to kill their children. I've never met anyone or heard of anyone who's argued the other side of that.
Right. The authority.
And then on the other hand, we can all agree that parents should have some control over their children, or at least that someone needs to have some control over children.
Yes.
That we shouldn't let toddlers just decide how they're going to live their lives. I've never heard a coherent argument for that cause.
You couldn't, and a toddler certainly couldn't make it.
As soon as he makes it, I might listen.
The toddler that can make it may deserve
exactly.
that.
May deserve
it. May warrant that. It's interesting. So there's obvious limits over the authority that a parent has over the child. They cannot kill them, as you said, that being the most clear. And obviously anything that, when we use the word abuse, what we're suggesting is the parent is abusing their authority, that they're harming the child in a way. I guess the term abuse in that context could be used in both the child is being abused and the authority is being abused. Both are being used badly. And when that happens, intervention is justified in the same way that if I rob Brad, there is some violent intervention that is justified. You can come in and restrict me in some way, proportional to the crime and governed by other principles. You can come in and rightfully use violence to restrict my freedom or to control me in some way or to make me repay the wrong and do these other things that we've discussed in other episodes. That is really hard in the relationship between a parent and a child. There are the clear examples where the parent is trying to kill the child. The parent is treating the child as if they are property that they can dispose of. The children are not property, right? They're independent human beings.
Parents are not owners of children. They're caretakers.
Right. I can take anything in this room. There's no living beings in this room. I could take anything in here and I could break it if I felt like it, right? I could throw it against the wall. I could throw it in the garbage. I could sell it.
And me watching you do it would have no just reason to intervene.
Right. You'd be really frustrated, but all of this
I could give you crap, but
to the degree that I exclusively own this stuff, which I do, then, or at least, I guess my family, not quite, but if I did exclusively own it all, I could destroy it. That is certainly not the case with a child. You are not the owner. You are something more like a trustee, or what's the word?
Yeah, I used caretaker.
Caretaker, trustee, a variety of terms that have been used. Locke used trustee, I believe, and just why that sticks out to me.
I like the analogy of a middle manager. Maybe it's because I am a middle manager. That you have a restaurant that's owned by someone, and you've got the person who's managing that restaurant. The person who's managing that restaurant is going to make all the decisions about what that restaurant isn't going to do within certain limits. You know what I mean? That manager may tell the customers they can be seated right away, or they can kick a customer out, whatever they need to make sure the restaurant is protected and also runs properly.
Mm-hmm.
And that's going to involve controlling the restaurant, right? But it doesn't mean that the manager has the right to burn down that restaurant or sell that restaurant to a customer or mismanage the restaurant. And if he does, there can be repercussions. But within the purview of what that manager is responsible for, and as long as he does it correctly, then he is in charge of that restaurant almost completely, as long as it's within that purview, even though he doesn't own it. And that's a lot like what parenting is that as long as you're within a certain purview, a certain range of actions and responsibilities, the parent has complete control.
Mm-hmm.
But as soon as they step out of those parameters, it can become unjust, and they can have, and there can be need for intervention.
And you can tell from like a state of nature, if the state has some authority over the child. You mentioned middle manager. Some people might say that
the government's the owner.
Yes, that the government is ultimately the owner.
It's the child.
That the government is the owner because they actually can choose to dispose even of your life by conscripting you into war. Right? That ultimately the government can do that.
Should it? That's another question.
I was going to say, yes, and there's a difference between whether or not that's that they can, because of they happen to have the might to be able to impose that is one thing, but that they, in this case, what they would mean is they can because that is morally within their prerogative to see to it to that. And again, this is the kind of political view that supposes that the state is the foremost thing and everything else is subservient to it.
And under that system, it's very simple. How do you decide what the parental purview is? Well, the government decides. How do you decide if the parents have gone too strong, have gone too far? Well, it's whatever the government feels is justified.
Right. If you have an absolute owner, the owner would decide. That's not, in my opinion, what human beings are. That's a terrible abuse of the term human being. If you're merely subservient,
if we're just owned by the government,
you're just owned by some other group of human beings, which happen to be in power. Anyway, so you have this unique relationship. It's not like your relationship to the government. I absolutely loathe analogies of the state as the father. And you hear it in the fatherland, motherland, right? The implication is that this is what gave you life.
It's a parent-child relationship, yeah.
It's simply not the case. In the absence of the government, you can have a life. You can actually have a good life. It is not the fundamental good that some philosophers, thinking Hobbes, Rousseau, and others, make it out to be.
Yeah, the causality is really important. Government didn't create us. Right. We created government. You can have adults who don't have children, but you don't have governments without people.
Yes.
Without people.
Right. And you could say that the argument usually goes something like this, that yes, that's true, Brad, but because the government protects us and makes our lives possible, therefore we ought to act like the government did come first, because in its absence, everything collapses. And you have, there are philosophers who've literally claimed that the worst government is better than no government.
It's better than no government. Mm-hmm.
Those people should have never gone camping, apparently, right? And compared that to what it's like to be in the gulag or something. It's I don't know what to tell you. There are places you can go and you can survive and you can be fine and you can actually. We've talked about those kids crashing on an island, right, and taking care of each other. And anyway, there were a lot of interesting assumptions about human nature that people made because they hadn't seen the absence of government. And so
and you bring up the kids on the island, and that's, Lord of the Flies, is the argument has always been made that if you let people live in anarchy, they will just kill each other or die. You know what I mean? There is no thriving outside of government, and that's just silly.
Yeah, it's wrong.
To put it simply.
Yeah, despite the fact that there is something akin to a government over virtually every place in the world, the absence of one does not mean total violence and war. As Hobbes is probably my favorite one who talks about this, where he's like, who described life as nasty, brutish, something else in short. I believe there are 4 in there, but he had this just like dire view of humanity. It was like, you got to have something so frightening, so powerful, the Leviathan that you... Anyway, that's not the case. That's not the case. The human tendency is not to dominate, as people once suspected it was in the absence of something stronger. But whatever the case, the government... Go ahead, please, if you have something.
I was just thinking about this, and I thought of an interesting way of putting it, is that the evidence of that is the fact that when people are in states of nature, and this is going to be counterintuitive at first, is that they actually create governments. You know what I mean? That when people are in a state of nature, they create governments because they want to cohabitate together. But the fact that they can even create governments when there are none demonstrates the fact that in the state of nature, they can cooperate. You know what I mean? That's what happens time and time again when you look at, American history, where they came here to the United States and were basically ungoverned. The early colonies had no intervention, especially no forceful intervention from Great Britain. It was just too far away, and there wasn't enough money in the United States for them to care, especially early on. And so they were in states of anarchy. And so what they did is they came together and they made agreements and they acted on them. And those agreements built and evolved into more and more advanced governments. But those very, very primitive governments were formed in states of nature, which meant that you had people in states of nature who were cooperating without force. And that's...
Without a government, at least, right? They no doubt, if you robbed them, would retaliate or do something. But
I'm saying that those early governments that were formed, it wasn't like you had 10 colonists with all the muskets who said, "Okay, you're going to be under our
They didn't
government."
conquer the others.
I'm saying people voluntarily they cooperated to create this government, not by use of force. That's what I'm saying.
Right. It's
which is anarchy.
Yeah. Since we're on this topic, it's worth pointing out that in the West. The Wild West, you have laws that are imposed and no government. Even in places that were so small that there was literally no sheriff even. And the laws were imposed by the fact that if you stole from someone, they didn't appreciate it. And they would go out of their way, if it were bad enough, to hunt you down. And they did occasionally do that, right? You'd have farmers spread out over a large area, and then people would come in and start stealing cattle or something. And if the threat was worth it to them, right, they would put down what they were doing. They would gather together. They would put together a group of people, a posse, and go hunt down these people and take care of it. Which is to say that you can actually have law, and do often have law, in cases where there is no government. It's just not law in the terms that we think of, where it's legislated. But most of our laws, the core of the laws that we're governed under today, were not legislated. It's the common law, and the common law is codified later, after it developed in basically an anarchic system of people dealing with problems with their neighbors in local scenarios. And it's like it was never a legislated law. It's a law built on actual practical interactions. And it is to this day the core of law in the world, which is which suggests something about human nature and the way the commonalities, even despite cultures, and anyway, yeah, it's really fascinating the way, if you look at laws developed in that way. What am I holding? If you look at laws developed in that way versus laws developed in other ways, right? And how practical they are and how universally agreed on they are generally. Anyway, the state is not primary. The state is not primary. And the state can't be primary if you believe the role of the state is to protect natural rights, right? That is a secondary purpose. It's people first. State helps. State serves some purpose within that context. So we've talked about the natural rights of the child and the limitations on their rights. And we've talked about the limitations on the parental rights. One thing worth noting here is the practical problem of actually imposing punishments on the parents. You brought this to our attention when we were discussing this.
Yeah, and it's something that we've talked about before with domestic abuse, where when you have people in a household living together, it becomes difficult to intervene without causing more harm. Well, with children, it becomes much more difficult, which I think is part of why domestic abuse is difficult, is because often children are involved. And with children, it's very simple. You have a parent who is mistreating their children in some way through neglect or, somewhere in that gray area, right? They're not killing them. They're maybe not physically abusing them or not on a regular basis or something in the middle here. But for sure, they're causing harm to their children. And maybe they're just really bad parents. And so you as an outsider look in and you see that and you're unhappy about that, which for the record, we've all done, right? We've all witnessed parenting that we were uncomfortable with.
Yes, parenting that we're uncomfortable. Abuse less, but certainly parenting that we're like, they're going to mess up that kid.
No, exactly. But isn't that harm?
Yes, that's the problem.
Harm? Isn't that...
You can certainly argue that, yes.
Isn't that them abusing their parental responsibility?
Yes, parenting is so hard. It's impossible not to screw up your kids.
It really is. And so you see that, and then when you see that, hopefully you didn't call the CPA. You know what I mean? Hopefully you didn't call Child Protective Services on CPS, not CPA. What's CPA? Child
Protective Agency. In some states, I think it is actually CPA.
So in some it's CPA, some it's CPS.
I think so.
Regardless, you didn't, hopefully, when you saw that, you didn't call the government to have them ideally take away the children from their parents, right?
Right.
Because that's the reasonable response if they're abusing their parental responsibility, is you take the children away from them and you find better caretakers.
Yeah, and I'm not saying the parents are a serious threat to the children, what else do you do?
Mm-hmm. But when you do that, even in a more serious scenario, like let's say the parents are trying to kill their children, right? And you take the children away, there's going to be harm done to those children by losing their parents and either going into foster care or even finding good, loving parents who are willing to adopt them. Whatever happens to them, there is very real harm that is done to these children. In the case of parents who are truly abusing them or trying to kill them or whatever, you can look at it and say, okay, well, this is causing harm, but it's much less harm than the alternative, which is, a practical, utilitarian approach. But in so many cases, the harm of intervening is far worse than the harm that the parents are doing. As you said earlier, all children are harmed by their parents, which we can all attest to because we can all remember some kind of trauma that we suffered because of how we were raised. You know what I mean? Even the best of parents made mistakes and caused harm to their children and abused their parental responsibility in some way, whether small or large. Mm-hmm. And so finding that line becomes very, very messy about at what point intervening becomes justified.
Yes. And as you mentioned, the solutions, the problem here is that the solutions are not good. I mean, the obvious solution to someone assaulting someone is to have some kind of recompense and perhaps jail time or something. how does the parent pay back the child? Like, and reimburse them? Like when they have control over their freedom, right? You can't have them give them exchange money. Like, what's that going to do for the kid if the parent determines all their decisions, right? You can imagine someone, a well-intentioned but silly cop, throwing some parents in jail for abusing their children, and then just forgetting about the children who then don't have parents for a while. Right? That's obviously not the solution. I'm sure that doesn't really happen in real life, except for by accident. But it becomes very difficult.
The problem.
Yeah. It's very difficult to navigate this, especially since, as you were saying, there's a bond between parent and child that almost always exists. It's very difficult to destroy that, so that separation is going to hurt the child, even in an abusive situation. Mm-hmm. I can think of situations where, and this is so hard dealing with, like, determining whether something is an imminent threat, so you have to remove them, at least temporarily, and figure out what's going on. And it's all very difficult. I know personally of several cases where children were removed from the home wrongfully. They misinterpreted injuries on a child as abuse that the child did not receive through abuse. There are horror stories of hospitals doing things like a kid goes to the hospital for some kind of injury. They notice bruises in a certain spot that looks like someone had gripped them. They're worried that it might be abuse, and they keep the children, and they call CPS. They do what's necessary, and the child simply doesn't go home with you. Mm-hmm. And that kind of
terrifying
thing actually happens. Mm-hmm. Schools that have access to it, depending on which state you're in, where your kid may go to school, and the school may decide that there are signs that you're abusing them, and they keep them. And then you have to go through a process where you're trying to prove you're innocent, which is extremely difficult to do.
And this is where it gets so messy, is because you understand immediately why those laws are put in place, because we've all heard the horror stories of these kids who are abused, and because they're kids, they don't speak out about it.
Right. They don't know to call the police or whatever.
Yeah, exactly.
If they
and so
did,
they're
they wouldn't be
stuck
believed.
in these horrible situations. And so when do we have the opportunity to intervene? Well, it's in situations like that. When the hospital sees something, when the school says something, we want to make sure that above all, we protect the child. So we understand why those laws are there. And yet even those laws that are pretty reasonable, you know what I mean? Seeing unusual bruising is not no evidence. You know what I mean? That's something concrete that they can point to and say, this is giving
this raises red flags.
Yeah, exactly. The kind of red flags that, if we go back to a state of nature example, where you might consider intervening and saying, hey, hold on, what's going on here?
Yes.
You know what I mean?
In a private capacity where you'd be like,
yes, as an individual.
Explain to me this on the kid or whatever. And you would be right to do so. You'd be right to
But it doesn't change
investigate.
the fact that even in those circumstances, like as Dan's saying, that seem pretty clear cut, there are lots of times where it's going to be wrong. And even that temporary process is going to be very harmful to the children.
Yeah, and the temporary process usually takes years. So temporary is relative. We've talked about these court problems of the time it takes to remove it.
No, and that one's much worse, because in that case, because in the court case you have a suspect who may or may not have committed a crime, and if they didn't commit the crime and they spend a year in prison before they get seen, then they suffer in that year, and that's suffering that was unjustified. Well, in this case, what you have is, it would be the equivalent of, okay, we're going to have the trial in a year, and in that meantime, we're going to put the victim and the suspect in prison for a year, in separate prisons, but they'll both be in prison until we get this solved. Because that's what happens, because the child is suffering too. I mean, it may not be, if it's abuse and they're not getting abused now, that's fantastic and that's good. But it doesn't change the fact that they're still going to be suffering.
It does. I'm thinking of a particular example of a couple whose I think 3 children were taken, and what they were trying to do, the processes they had to go through to meet with them, where they basically had to admit they were guilty to see their children and start taking classes on being good non-abusive parents, and they're trying to, their children are suffering, as you said. It is abuse to remove children from parents unjustly. It's abusive to the children. as well as to the parent, as well as your theoretical punishment for the parents being on innocent people. Anyway, these are very difficult places to navigate. And I'm going to just state that I don't think there is a good answer to, for the same reason domestic abuse, when it's not at the extremes, isn't always, there isn't always a clear solution that is the best solution. These cases are similar. It's very gray in the realm of abuse and what constitutes abuse. And when, even though you are justified in intervening with violence to restrict freedom or to change the situation, in cases where someone is wrongly harming another person, in these cases, you need to be extraordinarily careful because your intervention is likely to make it worse.
Yeah, and I think the principle that we should use in terms of parental rights is the principle of due caution, because you have to consider the fact that you are going to be causing harm, period, if you intervene, not just to the parents, but to the children. Yeah. I think that would be a fantastic principle that should be used when evaluating how programs like, Child Protective Services are set up, is saying, okay, what are interventions that are going to cause harm? Because anytime the children are taken away, we know for sure this is going to cause harm. Because there are steps before that. There are visits and things like that that are less harmful, and you can discuss the different harm levels. But as soon as you start talking about taking children away, you have to say, okay, if we do that, it's the equivalent of throwing someone in prison, where we've crossed a very clear line, and we need to have real justification before we do that. And we need to have a system set up that if they have to be taken away because there are clear signs, then okay, this is causing harm. Every day it's causing harm. So we need to resolve this
as fast as possible, right?
Immediately, not due process like the court procedure where it needs to be handled quickly. No, it needs to be handled right away and given ultimate priority, because we are not harming the parents here. We're harming the people we know are innocent victims.
Yes.
And so any day that we do that is causing unjust harm, and we have to stop it.
Yes, there is not a worse process in terms of, we've talked about how it takes years for these things to go through. And in the meantime, if the person's innocent, you're harming them. This is by far the worst case scenario for that. As you said, you're harming the most innocent and the victims. And it's terrible. It has to be done quickly. And the fact that we can't manage that is
the travesty.
Is a travesty.
Literally.
It really is. So having fleshed out some of these lines in some good principles, I think, guiding
as much,
principles.
Yes. At least fleshing out some principles is where the line
next step is to get on paper and
actually
write out the laws according to those principles and try and make them good, make them wise and expedient and all those things. All of that is to say, to bring it back to the initial questions, does not allowing your child to go through surgeries that have permanent effects and procedures that have permanent effects on their body constitute some kind of abuse? Or even any step along the way, right? Letting them dress the way they want to.
Is it harm done by the parents to the child? And this is where people are going to disagree. Because they're on one side you have people who don't believe in any kind of trans rights, who would say unilaterally, of course not. And then you've got the other side who would say if that child is actually trans, then absolutely it's going to be harming them to have the parents not allow them to transition. And then you've got people all in the middle, ranging from where we are, saying that, trans rights are something that should be respected, but it doesn't mean that children should have those same trans rights.
Right.
To many others.
That they have, you'd say that the child doesn't have a right to these surgeries that would then trump the parental authority over them. That ultimately, it's weird to me to think of, they always put these things in terms of rights, but it's two different terms. Rights used in the sense of parental authority and your right to life and liberty is fundamentally different than rights used as things that people should do for me to help me actualize my freedom and my potential as a human being. these are fundamentally different things. You can actually trace these words and how they were deliberately changed as a strategic exercise in vocabulary, right? So it sounds like we're pitting the rights of the child against the rights of the parent or the authority of the parent. We're not. We're pitting the rights and authority of the parent against a concept of abuse and the well-being of the child in some sense. And that's these rights are not clashing. There actually is no contest of rights here per se, unless you wanted to. I guess you could say that it's abuse because it's against the right to life of the child.
Well, yeah, and a good example of this is because basically what it is the argument is there's a positive right, which is the right of self-expression, really is what it is. And in this case, it's sexual self-expression. And that translates into gay rights, that translates into trans rights, that translates into...
Yeah, that's right.
Into the forced speech issues that have come up in Canada, where they've said, hey, you need to call that person whatever gender they would like because they have a right to their sexual self-expression. And the argument against that is very simple. It's that you don't have that positive right. Instead, you have what everyone else has, which is the ability as an individual actor. And in this case, we're talking about adults once again, because we've already established that children are different. But as adults and sometimes as children, you have the rights. You have not rights, but simply agency, freedom, whatever you want to call it, to do whatever you would like until you start harming someone else. Which is why when you go on social media and you say my preferred pronouns are this and that, not this and that, because those actually sounds like pronouns.
I was going to say
it's
confusing. That actually could be legitimate pronouns.
You know, my pronouns are he, him, or she, her, or they, or whatever it is. That's perfectly legitimate. But as soon and a totally reasonable thing for you to do, but as soon as you say, I'm going to use the instrument of government to force you to use my pronouns, now it's become a problem. You know, you as an individual actor choose to get a sex change, that's totally reasonable. As soon as you use the government to force, by bypassing parents, forcing parents to allow their children to get a sex change, that starts getting into crazy territory.
Right. At that point, you are running into actual rights that we can name and discuss, and that in other contexts people agree with. It's this whole transgender thing with children is a really, really odd exception. And we'll use California laws as kind of the example of what this in practice looks like. In California, your kid can get a sex change without your permission. And it will be paid for by the state. And if they go to mental care, they will be told that if they feel like a girl, that is right, they are a girl. And if they feel like a boy, or if they feel like something in between, or whatever it is, they will be affirmed in what they're done.
That affirmative care.
And they will be, and the therapist will lose their license if they recommend anything other than affirmation and advancing you towards whatever end goal you want.
Whatever you want, yes.
Which
once again, when we say what you want, we're talking about children. The same kids who
would
will
eat
say
candy for every meal if they could.
Yeah, or I mean the somewhat flippant analogy is, if a child says they're a dinosaur, parents don't believe them. But if the child says they're an opposite gender, then all of a sudden we have to give them a sex change.
Yes,
you know what I mean. That where is the litmus test for what we have all understood forever, which is that children are not mature, and now all of a sudden, when it comes to this one issue, only they know best. Like, I honestly don't know where that comes from. Regardless of Abigail Shrier's investigation, just thinking about it, at what point have we said all of a sudden that, yes, children are the best judges for themselves? When it comes to permanent life changes and decisions, it should just be the child that decides. Yeah,
and we haven't detailed this, but it's worth noting. If you the transitionary things, the puberty blockers, the hormone blockers, or giving someone hormones of another gender, permanently changes their body.
Yeah, just the hormones has crazy permanent effects.
It has temporary effects that are fleeting as it's in your system. It also has, especially in children, because children are growing.
Especially with puberty, because
especially with puberty, yes.
is based off of the hormones that you have. That when you're a male and you have testosterone, as you're going through puberty, it changes your body in certain ways. If you stop that testosterone and take estrogen instead and go through puberty like that, your body will physically change. How it the changes that take place will be different than they would have been, and a lot of those changes will be permanent.
Yes. Which is odd if there is a cost to this, and there is, because you're changing your body. Like tell me one other way you can change your body in which we pretend there's no cost. It's weird that people, the people who know that there's a cost are often not allowed to really explain it, because they're supposed to just affirm, right? They're supposed to pretend there's no cost, which is silly. But if there is a cost
to everything,
there is a cost to everything, and you don't get to affect the development of your body without it having long-term consequences. Much of which, you're not going to like, to say nothing of the surgeries, right? Which are obviously like you changing your organs. Or your anatomy, is going to have irreversible effects. There's this weird, if you're under the impression that that you can simply change back, you're wrong. You can't simply change back. There are permanent developmental effects on your body that are irreversible, which is the name of the book, right? This is one of the points. Some people don't seem to be aware that these decisions we're allowing the children to make are going to have irreversible effects on them that may affect them for the rest of their life negatively. So, why are we allowing them to make the decision?
Yeah, especially without any kind of discussion. And that's the craziest thing about affirmative care.
Yeah, without ever telling them the downsides. Yeah. Yeah, it's silly. So, it's interesting. The idea that there is a social contagion going through. The check on a social contagion or any other bad decision for children is that they don't get to make the important decisions in their life, right? Right. The dumbest in our population, in some sense, right? The least wise, the most unaware of costs, the most
historically stupid,
the most foolish, right? Nothing is more foolish than a toddler who's just learned to run.
Teenagers are literally infamous for having the worst decision-making skills. I mean, that's where so many problems happen, is in teenage years when you're making stupid decisions.
Yes, based on peer groups and things, and just enraging hormones that you're then going to play with.
Yeah, it's just, there's so much going on. It's nuts.
Yes. So the idea is that they're going to be checked, luckily, by the fact that they don't have freedom in the absolute sense. They have a limited
that's where
freedom.
You have parents come in. But the parent's job is to temper that.
What we've decided is, in this one sphere, in some states, parents don't get to temper the choices of their children. Based on what? Like you said, I don't see why this area is unique. Let's pretend. Let's assume. We'll assume the argument that gender is only knowable by the person who's experiencing it, and it is wholly unrelated to your sex. Whether you're male or female at birth, this is the separation of the two, right? There's no connection. We'll assume that, and therefore only that person has access to it. Why do you think your child's opinion of it at this moment is the right opinion that they're going to have long term?
Yeah, right? Because their opinion on who they think they want to marry, or who they want to grow up to be, or even what they want to spend their time doing, is often not correct. It's something they're going to regret and disagree with years later.
Yeah, if you want to push the concept of gender to the realm of subjective truth, which is truths only known from the eye of the beholder, right? Things like, do you love somebody?
Yeah.
Your mom and dad can't answer that, right? They don't know the 16-year-old Romeo and Juliet's woes and feelings. Only they could know that, in the same way that they argue only they could know gender. But why would you grant them full power to make decisions regarding that choice at this time? That's the question that I don't even see discussed, other than to say, if you don't let them do this, it will harm them. And that is such a poor argument, given that we know that most of them are actually going to grow out of this, right? Why at this moment? Like, my kids want to do things that will hurt them, that they think will make them happy subjectively all the time. And I don't let them do it. They want to eat candy. They know it will make them happy. It won't. It'll make them sick. They've had way too much today or whatever. You know what I mean? Like, once we jumping into the realm of subjective truths with gender does not somehow make it clear that they should get to make these decisions.
Yeah. Subjective is decisions are already a normal process where parents intervene.
Yeah.
I think the romantic one is a good example that as a 15-year-old, you may fall in love with another 15-year-old, and what you really want to do is run away and get married and live with that 15-year-old right now. And that, as far as you know, it feels right and it feels like the best decision in the world, and yet your parents will still step in and say no. And then they may disagree on what the no is. They may say, yeah, date them, but don't go live with them. You know what I mean? Or they may say, you shouldn't date right now. Depending on the parent.
They may say you can't ever see them again.
Depending on the parent, you can disagree about what the right line is. But most parents will agree that they won't let those two 15-year-olds get married and go run off and live their utopian dream because they know it's a bad idea. Even if, and this is important, even if that love is real and right, like that person is the right person for them, but they need to wait a little bit longer. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Even then, the parents have a right to step in and say, no, not right now.
And
that's basically what we're arguing for this transition is even if you're right, even as a child, you're right that you don't feel like that you are not comfortable in your own skin. You know what I mean? Even if that feeling is legitimate and will stick around and is not fleeting, doesn't mean parents don't have a right to tell you no, not right now.
Yeah. Going back to your cautionary principle of intervention, you need to be absolutely sure that the parents stopping them constitutes real abuse. And the bar for that, the evidence for that isn't there, especially since a wide percentage of the time it simply goes away. That's, and especially if the parent happens to be in a position where they can identify this as a whim or a fashion, right? A passing, fleeting thought. And to assert that as soon as the thought is present, this particular thought is present, it must be acted on affirmatively with permanent changes.
Yeah, and if they have that thought, we know they're right all of a sudden.
We know, yes, they may be wrong about every other thing they've thought today, but then they said, I'm actually a girl, and we know that's pure truth. And
all of a sudden.
And a permanent truth that warrants a permanent change. Is
crazy when you say it like that.
It is crazy.
How is that not crazy?
It is crazy. I think.
How is that not so different from a 25-year-old who says, you know what, I've been thinking about it a lot for years, and I've come to this conclusion, and I've looked at my life and realized this is what I want, and this is what I think is right for me, and then starts going through a process. How is it not clear that is so different
these are
from a 12-year-old? That these are two entirely different things.
Right. Yeah.
How is that not clear?
I don't know. I think a lot of people have accepted a view of the world in which the subjective truths are the only really important thing. And your self-expression, as you said, they've elevated self-expression to the highest value. And then they've picked various pieces that
various
they think
types of self-expression that are going to be promoted.
That for the same reasons certain types of things are fashionable, these things become the highest and they define your self-expression. I don't know why gender is the one fixated on here as opposed to any number of other things that express you, like your interests, which used to be the big thing, right? It's okay to be a jock. It's okay to be a nerd. It's okay to be right? This used to be the TV shows. Now it's like, it's okay to be non-binary. It's okay to be, right? We've turned to some other fashion in the realm of self-expression that we're trying to make okay, which is fine. To destigmatize it is not the problem, right? That's destigmatize it, let people make decisions, let adults make their own decisions.
Yeah, I mean, primarily what we're arguing about here is allowing the parents to play that tempering role like they do for every other decision a child makes.
Right. We're politically, we're arguing there is no justification for intervention here on the grounds of abuse to overrule the parents. It just isn't there. Now, it's possible that a parent, and there are lawsuits probably that are coming, that kids who were affirmed, who then made changes that have permanent lasting impacts on their life and health, are going to go back and sue the people who affirmed it. Because they're looking at very real harm.
Yeah, because just like you could do the same thing to your parent as a 12-year-old. If your parents agreed to let you cut off your arm when you were 12 for no good reason, then you could go back and sue your parents and say, I was 12. I had no idea what I was doing. You should have stopped me.
You should have stopped me. Yes, that is a legitimate argument for a kid to make looking back and sue their parents. You actually can make those kind of claims as an adult when you look back and you see your parents allowed something that was absolutely unreasonable and caused that isn't gray, right?
Yeah.
And I think the case that allowing it is much more of an abuse. I think there are better grounds for allowing it to constitute abuse than there are generally for not allowing it. The caution seems to be the caution and waiting. People with serious gender dysphoria, it doesn't go away, right? It lasts. It keeps coming back. It keeps bothering them. It's a very perpetual thing. The idea that you should act on it early is foolish. It's not going to. It's going to
cause more harm than good.
You're going to pick up a larger segment of people that actually don't have it than you're going to help who actually do. And I'm not convinced that there's yet to be significant evidence that even in the cases where they have serious just gender dysphoria, that treating it in this way is the right path.
Is even the best solution.
Right, that changing their bodies actually is the best solution. That
when
itself
the argument is made
still
right
up for
now
debate.
that the only thing we can do is act right now, right this second, is the only reasonable path.
Yeah,
and it's like you said, it seems more and more that it's a fad more than anything else because it's so popular, and disagreeing with it is in so many ways, social suicide. That even having this conversation on our podcast would immediately turn us into a fringe if we weren't already living on the fringe. You know what I mean?
Right. If we were a big podcast, this would be dangerous.
Mm-hmm. We're already so reckless that we'll be just fine. But what we're saying by having this conversation is extremely controversial, and that's part of the problem. And why this fad continues is because there's nothing you can say against it without instantly being, socially destroyed.
Right. The possibility that we're wrong, I'm very comfortable with. The idea that by expressing these things and being wrong about them is so outside of what should be allowed that we should be censored is ridiculous, right? Like if we're wrong, come talk to us, right? Like we come show us where we're wrong, show us how, explain to us how there actually are no long-term consequences for these things, or how turns out everybody actually getting picked up in this actually does have gender dysphoria, and that gender dysphoria ought to be treated in this manner. Things which we don't actually have.
That's a lot of things you're going to have to demonstrate that.
Right, to get these assumptions. And I don't know why if gender is so disconnected from sex, that the two are unrelated. Why it has to
be fixed right now.
Why then you have to change your sex? Why can't you just assert your gender and be that thing? If that thing is entirely subjective, why are you trying to make it objective?
No, I mean, that alone is an excellent question,
right.
Dan.
Right.
Why does one have to match the other if they're so independent? I don't know.
If they're fully independent to begin with, why do they have to align later? There's no... people argue that there's no connection between the two. And if there's no connection, why do we read the other question
is if there are 1,000 different genders, why are we so fixated on changing you from male to female and female to male? You know what I mean? Like a lot of these things I don't understand. I legitimately don't understand. I don't get it.
Right.
I don't understand. And I think part of the reason for that is because there aren't good answers for all of these questions.
Yes, and no doubt some group may have a more consistent view, right? Internally consistent view. We're looking at lots of different people saying lots of different things, and certainly the big picture doesn't make sense.
The amalgam of all those different views is the mainstream view that's being held right now, and
right,
that view doesn't work. Right,
and we've gone into specific individual claims. The specific individual claims don't work, and so it's weird. It's hard to believe that any combination of them could then be consistent. They could be more consistent, but they couldn't be.
And the crazy thing, Dan, is that even if all of these claims were backed up, it would still be reasonable to have the parents involved in it. You know what I mean? And that's what makes making this claim that we're making right now so easy, is that what we're asking for is so reasonable. We're not trying to shut down the program. We're trying to temper it. You know what I mean?
Yes.
And
you're right. You could say, even if, grant everything that they're suggesting is true, it's possible that by bypassing the parent and having the child change his gender without the parent's consent and against the parent's wishes causes more harm by dividing the parent and child than this solution would fix. And there's so many levels at which this has problems that are not being discussed. That it's hard to know where to start. And why we've picked to focus a little bit on the natural rights side of it.
And it's definitely, the more you look at it, the more it's impossible to justify laws like they have in California. That are so clearly that are so clearly broken to favor just one outcome, which is, children transitioning.
Yeah, the schools in California will go so far as to lie to the parent while they're moving the child along, and have created a new identity for them and other things. And so it's like, it's clearly an overreach in California, but the whole thing seems to be grounded in clouds, like subjective valuations of a child at a particular moment is a bad grounds for eternal truths that are going to make them happy throughout their life. And how do you distinguish those from normal silly thoughts of children? It's
and part of the reason it works is because everyone right now is so afraid of looking like they're backwards. Looking like they're outdated.
You're right. Yeah.
And they're not open to new ideas, because if you're anti what California's doing, you're anti-trans, which means that you are prejudiced, which means you're probably homophobic and also racist, and et cetera, et cetera. Next thing you know, you're in this outcast group that no one wants to be in. And so people tread lightly about it. People say, talk very carefully, don't say these things because you can get in trouble. That's specifically like us talking about this right now. Someone said to me, well, be very careful how you talk about this. And I said, well, I'm going to try and be careful, but I will not be as careful as you want me to be, because that feeling that you're feeling is that I felt too, which is that don't talk about it at all. That's the easiest solution, is just don't talk about it.
Yeah.
Don't be in favor of it. Just don't talk about it. It'll be better for everyone.
Yes, I spent exactly zero time worrying about where the lines were of what was okay to say in this conversation, because if I did that, we wouldn't be able to have the conversation really, right? We'd be dancing around. I'd be more worried about how to say things and how to avoid things than actually trying to think about
what matters, and about the actual issues,
about the actual
we all should be looking at and thinking about and talking about.
Yeah, as a final little bit, the big issue is, as you were suggesting, I think just there, you nailed the reason. If you're wondering, how could the experts, because experts will endorse the things we're arguing against, how could they be so wrong? The answer is in the social pressure being applied to them. The authoritative bodies have been co-opted, even in the absence of data, to supporting these kind of things. And once the top moves, because of the way licensure works, most of the experts are going to get in line.
Everything follows, yeah.
Everything follows, yeah. Some of these, having a single authoritative licensing body with connections, if not explicitly endorsed and set up by the government, is a bad system that's easily corrupted by things like this. Mm-hmm. Because once the top decides, the rest follow suit. If you lose your license by telling someone, look, what you're experiencing may just pass, we should wait. If that's enough to get you to lose your license, and it is under a lot of boards and in some states,
yeah,
then of course they're going to conform. And why would the groups jump on board this? It's because it's nested in a bigger story about LGBTQ rights and about oppression
and part of how the silencing works is you either conform and you add your voice or you stay silent. Right. So you have all of these silent dissenters whose voices aren't heard, and so it's like they don't exist.
Yeah, you get the illusion of unanimity among experts.
Because up until this episode, I was a silent dissenter, and so I'm not being counted amongst those who disagree. Our podcast has not really said anything about this, and so we were part of that group, which is a very large group that has very little power because they're not doing anything.
Because they're not dissenting. Yeah, they're not vocally.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah, a silent dissenter isn't worth anything.
Right. Its potential is all it is. It's interesting. If it weren't, I've got to believe that if people looked at this issue independently and weren't like, Abigail Shrier talks about this, when she talks to people, what they begin with is a disclaimer. I support LGBTQ rights, but my child is going to get these treatments and things, and I can't stop it. And it's not what they think it is, right? This is not going to help them. We want to be cautionary, whatever it is, whatever they don't really get a say. And they don't know how to stop it without being labeled, or in some cases, like California, being straight up run over. Sometimes the pressure is social, and that's what they're dealing with. And sometimes it's actual government authority. And that disclaimer shouldn't be necessary. We can consider these issues individually. We can look at this, and we can talk parental rights, we can talk government authority, we can talk about where the line is, what constitutes abuse, then we can explore the actual details of this and say, is this abuse, or do we need to wait? Is there reasons for caution? At what point do we overrule the parents' right? We can have this conversation and not be questioning or even discussing anything related to whether or not there should be gay marriage, right? Like, these things are not related. They're not. The cause, they all fly under the same flag for some reason. There's a great book, The Madness of Crowds by Douglas Murray, who talks about this at length, how actually in some cases their interests are opposing one another, but they're all caught up in the same political coalition. But that coalition is not a coherent philosophy. And you have to keep that straight. You can't just take the propaganda of the party, which tries to take a bunch of competing interests and make it seem like one thing when it's not.
One idea.
When it's not. Yeah. None of this. Your standing as a bigot is not at stake by considering this. Now, people think it is. They think it is, but they're wrong.
That's a great way of putting it.
They're wrong. And this is not a referendum on your opinion of progress in freeing people who've been socially and legally oppressed, right? These things are not connected.
I think that was fantastically well put. Thank you guys for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this episode.
Take care.
This has been an episode of Rethinking Politics. You can find us on all of the major podcasting apps or on YouTube. You can reach out to us at rethinkingpoliticspodcast@gmail.com, or you can visit our website at rethinkingpolitics.podbean.com, where you can support us via Patreon. Thanks, and have a wonderful day.